I am very, very tickled. And I know Marilyn likes to use specific words, and she has said before in other interviews in terms of things like excited. And I find myself now, am I excited or am I not excited? No, I'm probably excited, mostly excited. I am very, very tickled to be able to present to everybody here Marilyn McEntyre. For the people who are from Radix and from New College Berkeley, you already know a bit about Marilyn. For those who don't, Marilyn is the author of numerous books, including Caring for Words in a Culture of Lies, Speaking Peace in a Climate of Conflict, When Poets Pray, Where the Eye Alights, and numerous others. She's a longtime professor of literature and medical humanities, a speaker, amongst other cool things, including being a parent and a grandparent, as she has mentioned before. She says inside of her website, she said, "My deepest interests lie in connections between spirituality, language, and healing the earth and each other," which is, of course, a lot. And if I can just put in a plug for New College, for those who have taken some of Marilyn's creative writing courses, they'll know how lovely it is to be there. And it's more than just learning about words and learning how to create words, but it's also about how to see the world. And of course, when we do see the world better, then it enables us to see other people better and interact in a more meaningful way. When it comes to attention, Ian McGilchrist, in his last book, The Matter with Things, has this to say, and I thought it's an important thing to mention. He says, "The world we experience is affected by the kind of attention we pay to it. Attention changes the world. How you attend to it changes what it is you find there. What you find then governs the kind of attention you will think it appropriate to pay in the future. Attention is the ultimate creative act. It renders the world what it is. It is therefore a moral act. It has consequences." So, what does Dr. McIntyre's book, Midwinter Light, have to do with attention? As I was scribbling this down, I thought, well, that's a pretty good question. So now I'll have to answer the question. I think partly it has to do with her helping us cleanse our inner eye from the filming effects of familiarity. And familiarity is something we can all suffer from. We think something is familiar and we don't value it as much. And so when we're dead to the world around us through familiarity, it's not a good thing. And I think, at least when I read this book in its 40 reflections, I constantly found myself reading her words, looking out my window. I'm privileged enough to have a nice view out the window, and learning about things like the importance of radical amazement. And maybe someone even wants to ask a question about radical amazement afterwards, or the importance of subtlety, or the role of memory, how it's so important how we remember things from the past, or how we tend to see in layers, but also the importance of language. And in her books, in her lectures, in her talking, Marilyn constantly is talking about the importance of language, that we really think about language. And then, as the title says, it also shows us how to see beauty in winter. And I am so much better for having dwelt in these pages and knowing you a little bit, Marilyn. Thank you so very, very much for being involved in this event.
Oh, thank you, Matthew. I'm honored to be invited.
So, to get right to you, can I ask to start off with, what projects are you involved in right now that are I was just about to use the word exciting, but they probably are.
I've infected that word for you. I always have my finger in a number of pies, but I suppose the most obvious thing that I'm currently involved in is I have another book coming out from Erdmann's. I hope later this year, maybe early next year. One of the editors asked if I would write a book about writing, which hadn't been on my personal agenda. But since I've written so much about words and language and using language, and I've taught writing for so long, my first thought was there are lots of books about writing. You know, every writing instructor knows there are piles of books from major publishers about how to write. But then I thought, I've taught writing for over 30 years, and I have lots of handouts, and they're pretty good handouts. So I went and looked through my handouts and started to have a really good time with it. we haven't settled on a title yet, but my preferred title is Start with a Word. And I taught a course some time ago called Writing from Inside Out. And my basic approach to writing is to work at it somewhat open-endedly and intuitively, not to overplan or overstructure, but to really see how the spirit speaks as you're in the process of writing, and allow yourself creative digressions and come back and just see where you're led. So I do think that the work of writing, at least for a person of faith, runs very close to the work of prayer, in terms of directing attention and receiving help. And I say thank you a lot when I write, when something comes and I think, wow, I don't think I made that up. Thank you very much. So I've tried to write a book about writing in that spirit and to offer examples of questions to ask oneself as you write, and also to offer little excerpts from writers I particularly respect and have learned from. So to think about how you read like a writer and how you can be an apprentice to the writers that you love and make them all be your teachers. It's turned out to be a fun project.
Okay. And do you mind saying a little bit more about what you do and some of your programs at New College?
Oh, sure. Well, one of the main things I have done over the past year or two for New College, although I've been with New College for a long time, but most recently I've been doing this once a month writer's workshop, and each one is on a different topic related to writing, and I give exercises and so on, but they're freestanding sessions so that people don't have to sign up for the whole series. Those have been fun to invent one after another. I think the most recent one was, it was called Poetry on Purpose. And it was looking at ways of approaching the craft of poetry, both as a reader and writer. Another one was on character and working on characterization in both fiction and nonfiction. Another was on metaphor, which could have been a whole series in itself. But those are really fun conversations. And it's such a pleasure to have conversations about these things with people who care about faith and care about writing and care about words and each other, and just leap right into it. So hope they keep going.
Right.
Over the years, I've taught a number of courses that always have something to do with faith reading and writing for New College, and they have covered some of the topics of my books, and sometimes they're more topical. I think I did one on grief work and the language of grieving and speaking of sorrow, I think it was called. I did that one on writing from inside out. I did one recently on writing into the historical moment. And that's a pretty pertinent one right now. How do we find language for what we are all witnessing?
Right. Would you mind speaking a little bit about that?
A little bit. Yes, I'll try. It's just huge. Every single day now, I know you're a Canadian. You have the happy situation up there, witnessing this from a certain distance, but the American political scene is more fraught than it has been in my lifetime, and more divided, and Christians are very much divided, and the word Christian is embattled. And so I think we really need each other's help about how to stay in conversation, how to hold on to the wisdom that neutrality, there are times when neutrality is complicity. And I don't think that fairness or justice demands a kind of bland neutrality, but rather that we help one another be faithful to something that isn't a political party. What are we being faithful to? It's such an important question right now. And it's a question I've raised in literature classes often, just to say, as you read this, consider, what is this writer being faithful to? What particular vision of humanity? What particular understanding about women? What understanding of how a story should work? What understanding of authorial privilege? All of these things. But what is this writer holding to? And I think to ask ourselves, as we try to be good Christians and good citizens and bearers of good news and people who have some kind of integrity in the middle of all this, what do we do with all the buzzwords that are floating around and the outright lies or misrepresentations? I had a letter just recently from a woman who had been to one of my talks. I don't know her personally, but she said she's really agonizing over news sources. And I think it is a time to gather in circles of trust and rely on each other's wisdom to raise for one another some of the discernment questions that we hold as we look at the news, read what we call the news, try to make judgments about what's being said in public. So we have to help one another navigate a pretty murky, contaminated, discursive environment, among other things. How do we discern the truth? And so there are test questions. I might post them at some point or send them to you. You can put them in Radix. But I've developed a list of questions that I think are helpful to me to try to detect where's the bias here. And by the way, I think that even the word bias is problematic because some people use it to mean anyone who is doing public reporting who has a strongly held opinion is biased. And that is not how I understand the term. My understanding of the term is you can be a strong advocate for a particular position. And if you put that out there and acknowledge it, you're not being biased, you're adopting a position, as Martin Luther did when he said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." But I understand bias to mean when you pretend to objectivity, but you actually have a hidden agenda that favors a particular partisan position.
Right.
And there's plenty of that going around too.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that in order to write into this moment or to speak publicly into this moment is to do a little bit of the meta conversation, as I'm doing right now, to acknowledge to everyone present that we are in a very tricky, difficult, emotionally fraught, historically highly unusual moment. And that all of us are trying to find our way, but that the terms we have historically used to make distinctions, both political and theological, are slippery right now because they're being used by different people for different purposes.
Mm-hmm. 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 Thank you for that. To get into your book, you've obviously written with the motive in mind and motivations in mind. What should we be looking for? What should we be aware of that you were trying to get us to see from this book?
Well, there's a backstory to this book that I assume it's all right to tell, but the editor at Broadleaf who first introduced the idea that she wanted me to write a book of meditations on poems about Advent and for Advent. And there are plenty of books out there for the season of Advent or the season of Lent. So these kinds of liturgical publications are a genre unto themselves. So I set about doing that and finding poems and reflecting on them. And then she suggested that we broaden it out to winter reflections and write a book that would be more broadly appealing to people who maybe didn't identify as Christians who would have the tradition of celebrating Advent as such, but people who recognized in the winter months a season of life and a way of being that really has some spiritual dimensions to it. And so that changed the assignment. And so then it became a slightly longer book. And I began to think about winter. And honestly, I'm not unaware of the irony of asking a Californian to write meditations on winter. Any of you who do not live here would probably be in a better position to really reflect on the experience of winter. Obviously, I've lived elsewhere, but I've spent most of my life in California, and snow is something you go to. But I did think about seasonality a lot as I was working on this. And that in itself is kind of an interesting matter for us these days, because one of the effects of climate change that is subtle in some ways, but that we're beginning to experience more explicitly, is the disruption of seasonality. You know, harsher winters in some places, drier summers in other places. There are atmospheric barriers that have been breached, as have been explained to me, that mean that we can't count on the rhythmic cycles of planting and harvest seasons as we once did. So it's going to affect all of us over time in ways that we begin to absorb just in our bodily life. Summers have been much hotter, as we know, every single year for the last several years. It's been the hottest year on record. So right now, we're having what resembles winter in Sacramento. And I'm so grateful for every day of rain. I'm grateful for the cold, because I know that we have a long, very hot summer coming. And that awareness also makes me think about how we live into the challenges of seasonality and what the body needs, how we protect ourselves from extreme heat and cold, how we gather, what kinds of consolations we need from each other for the challenges of seasons. And then also seasonality and regionality, as I've mentioned, are make us of interest to each other. What is it like to where you are? It's not unrelated to what is it like to be who you are. So the assignment also to look for poems rather than just write reflections. I've written books of reflections, and those are fun, but it's also interesting to refract my reflections on a topic through someone else's work and the way a poet represents a moment of living into this season, because it is also in its way a book about how to read poetry and why we need it, which is, one of the things that I like bringing up whenever possible. I had a talk that I've given in many places called "Why Read a Poem at a Time Like This?" A really interesting question, if you think about it. It first came to me from a student years ago who was an econ major and could only fit in one English class that she had to take, which was advanced poetry. It was clearly not her thing. And she came and asked me, some of you have heard this story, but she came and asked me a few weeks into the semester, she said, "I don't want to be impertinent, but why do people do this?" I said, "Do what?" And she said, "Well, sit around and read poetry and talk about it." And the thought that came to me was, she really deserves an answer. Of course, it's not self-explanatory, not now, not when, all of the urgencies that are of public interest have to do with how do we find scientific solutions to things or medical solutions to things. And how is a poem not frivolous activity? And it isn't. And I think there are cultures in the world where people are embattled and people are living at the edge, and the poets are really important voices for them. And so what poetry does for the vigor of language, and what poetry does by way of offering a means of truth-telling that's fundamentally different from prose, epistemologically different, I think that does not go without saying in this culture, where people think of poetry as flying people and doing cafes in front of their friends. But we need it now. I think we need the poets especially poets, to come into that environment of words I was describing and help us to retrieve and hold up words that matter and pause over them and turn them to new angles. That's the work of poetry anyway. It's sort of the deep work of plowing up the discursive soil or the linguistic soil that we count on and giving it new life, letting us hear words in a new way.
When you started off with this, during this time, and there's always these times, we always think we're living in difficult times, although it seems like now we are, it seems like it's more so. In C.S. Lewis's essay, Letters in Wartime, he brings this introduction about why it's important to learn despite the fact it's World War II. Don't we have better things to be doing about this? Like, it's the end of the world right now. Josef Pieper talks about this in The Importance of Leisure, about we're talking about leisure, it's the war. Like, we have to rebuild, we have to do these things. But there's always time for the normal. But you've actually, at least to me, you've helped explain, I'm not that much of a poetry person, though I'm beginning to appreciate it more. But it's not just something normal. You've given kind of words to show that poetry is actually very, very important. I mean, writing is important, but the poetry, like, yeah, thank you.
Hmm. Well, of course, they're also, poetry and prose aren't just in two separate boxes. There are very poetic prose writers, and there are poems that are strongly narrative. But what does a poem do is the core question. And I think that the way that a poem makes you, contemporary poetry makes you stop at the end of a line when the sentence isn't finished yet, just to take a simple example, so that you begin to hear what a phrase does all by itself before it grows up to be a sentence. And it slows you down over language, so that you begin to look at the language the way a glazier looks at glass, where most of us look through it. But to hear the words themselves as little living things. When we talk about scripture as a living word, I think the concept of the living word is somewhat more inclusive than that. But to talk about a sacred text as a living word is that it invites you to enter it and wrestle with it and live into it. And I think that that's what great literature does. Not to say that all great literature has the status of a sacred text, but language at its best is both invitational and surprising. And words just can't be nailed down. They have to be lived with. And so every speaker and every writer brings the breath of life to the word. And the ancient Hebrew understanding of utterance is that it is so important because words are made of the breath of life. When you speak them, they're made of breath. I mean, I just love that idea, right? That what we're doing when we offer each other words is what ties us into kind of vibrational environment together. I can go on and on, Matthew, but I wanted to let you, do your thing. You're the interviewer.
I do love that image of, and you've talked about this in other interviews that I've listened to and in books, but that idea, I think, for all of us, for me, it's nice for me, words as being these things, living things that we give birth to and then kind of travel about and go beyond. And this is the beauty of creating something from our breath that is lovely and good and meaningful and supportive and enabling a flourishing, instead of maybe words that aren't so much, and then, cast despair and weevil into people's innermost parts and make them feel a little bit queasy or something. It's very cool. It's very cool.
Well, can I add an addendum before you go to some other kind of question?
Yeah, please.
Popped into my head. This is a creative digression. Okay. Recently, I don't know where this law is going to go, but just recently, the state of California passed a law that said cursive handwriting still needs to be taught in public schools, which has fallen away in many places. I've had college students who never learned cursive. And I have heard some very interesting panels at calligraphy conferences about the importance of cursive writing, where you join letters together. I mean, practical importance is that you couldn't read historical documents if you can't read cursive. So there's some kind of answers to why study cursive writing. But more importantly, graphologists will tell you that what you're doing when you shape a letter, when you form a word, draw it, so to speak, that is a form of self-representation. And I took a short course in graphology one time. It's fascinating. They use it in criminology, and sometimes they use it in diagnostics. But our relationship to words has a unique dimension when we make them in cursive writing. So I just wanted to pay that do that unpaid political ad there for teaching cursive writing, because it's not something a lot of kids are learning. As they learn to keyboard earlier and earlier, something is it's diminishing. And I think we can help to cultivate it if we give it some attention.
I think even in terms of memory retention, back in 2016, I think it was something done in Harvard, and it said that people in terms of memory retention, writing notes. I mean, old school is not the right. I like writing notes, and instead of, typing things. And the memory retention, at least at this time, I think it was 2016, the memory retention is better with people who write instead of just type. It creates something, it inscribes it in your head better when you're writing it down versus typing.
Well, it's a neural pathway from your brain to your hand. It's different if you're keyboarding.
Right. Mm-hmm. To get back to your book.
The book.
You've mentioned before that the book doesn't neatly fit into typical categories. It's not an essay. It's kind of a variety of things. Can you tell us more about why you chose, and you have already to some degree, why you chose to make it the way that you did?
Well, a number of my books I think of as reflections, which are basically personal essays exploring what have we here, whether it's a question or a poem or a word. I wrote a book called Word by Word, where I just decided to do a reflection each day on a single word and stay with one word for a whole week. Hey, somebody just held that up. Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. That was really fun to do. And honestly, when I wrote that book, I was thinking, I hope this is a kind of go thou and do likewise invitation to readers, because it's such a fruitful process. Just take a word a week and live with it. And each day think, yes, what more, how do I think about the word accept? What does it mean to accept? How is acceptance different from capitulation? And stay with it and stay with it. Anything you keep staying with and coming back to begins to reveal new dimensions to it. And so I think, the term reflection I would use to describe a lot of my writing. I also like it because it's not the same as essay. I have written essays, which is a very particular form of nonfiction prose that has a long history going back to Montaigne and beyond. It's got a wonderful history. I wrote a piece about essays for Comment one time, and how much I love them. But even Montaigne, who is thought of as a kind of father of the essay form, essay in French simply means a trial, a kind of experiment. I'll try this. Essayer does mean to try. So an essay is where you can kind of plant an idea and see what happens, and see what comes out. So I still feel as though when you write, and I tell people this in writing workshops, you're not only offering your thoughts to someone who can then like them or dislike them or take them somewhere, but you're always modeling something too. And so I think, especially other writers who read, I would hope that engaging in reflection, the business of reflection, taking the personal dimension of it seriously, making it public, always is an invitation to others to try this. It's a way of processing things that matter publicly and sharing them. And I generally tell people in writing workshops too, use human language when you talk to yourself about what you're doing. And instead of saying, I need to, I want to publish, or I want to produce, or I want to prove, or I want to establish, all these kind of academic words, I like hanging on to words like, what do I want to share? And what do I want to invite my readers to reflect on? And how do I write hospitably so that that I can create a space here that other people can enter and be thoughtful in? Not that I don't bring up controversial things. And these days, I think we have to have the courage to bring up things that readers will then feel free to disagree with. But agree or disagree hasn't been, for me, the primary point. I'm not trying to prove something so that I can to prove something to people who would potentially disagree with me. I certainly do have strongly held opinions, and they come out in some of these, but mostly I think there's a gentler process of being human together and saying, oh, this is what I see. This is what came up for me. But I hope that there's a kind of, how about you, at least implicit in a lot of this kind of writing. And so writing about poems, as I did in this book, I think of as a way of saying, let's read this together. Here's what I see. Here's how I got there. What about you? So that what about you has to kind of be read into it. I don't get to just write that. Like the publisher will edit it out.
That hospitality and invitationalism is, I think, important for us to be, even in terms of being, the word witness is it's kind of loaded, but to be good witnesses, the hospitality, humility, and this invitational porousness of, okay, what do you think about this? And inviting people to at least feel like they're not being imposed on and told, but to be shared. We all know that we accept things better, or are more likely to hear things if we're invited into it rather than clobbered.
I think so. And another thing that's occurred to me to suggest to people is just to hang on to the childlike energy that says, hey, look at that. When children notice things, there's something so pure about it, about that, hey, look moment. Hey, look, Mom, how big the moon is, and all of a sudden it's startling. And there's, you mentioned the term radical amazement, which is Abraham Heschel's term. He believes that to live authentically is to live in a state of radical amazement, which I think of as the haiku poets too, saying, hey, look at the moon. Hey, look, there's a rabbit. And not in a childish way, but just to really cultivate what Buddhists call beginner's mind, that says there's something to be surprised by, to look for the moments of surprise. Like, oh, look, that bud opened this morning. It was closed yesterday. Just to notice, and then notice what you notice. The habit of noticing is a habit that kind of has to be cultivated. You spoke at the beginning about the problem of familiarity, and it's really easy to fall into that. And especially because I think we live in a world of standardized products. So in order to even pause and look at the natural world, we have to be intentional, those of us who aren't farmers. We have to make an intentional exit from the Targets and Walmarts and, supermarkets, and walk out into a world in which there are things to be noticed that aren't just the color of the plastic or the price of the product.
That is such a good point about the lack of particularity. Not that you said this, but I'm thinking it's in line with that. The lack of particularity, if we buy something that's consumer made at large, as compared to, I'm just thinking, if you get eggs from a farmer, you'll open up a dozen, but you're going to open it up and you're going to see a disparity of sizes as compared to if you get it from your Safeway, Walmart, or whatever. They're all, it's your medium, small, and large, extra large, in the way that soap is slightly different if you get it at a farmer's market. It's got little imperfections, which turn out maybe not to be an imperfection, but actually it can look pretty. But that idea of the need to intentionally keep on looking, this is kind of, it's off script for me, but you've talked before about the importance of Lectio Divina. And, when you were mentioning about just focusing on one word at a time or a small group of words, could you talk a little bit about, to you, why Lectio Divina is important and maybe should be practiced, especially by everybody?
Yeah, I think it's a habit of mind, not just a way of prayer. I mean, I assume most of the people here on this call are familiar with it, but just to review it, it is a way of reading scripture that Saint Benedict taught his monks in the 5th century, which is to take a short passage and read it listening for the word or phrase that awakens you, just a word or a phrase that invites you. And it's so important that it's a word or a phrase, not a statement, not a claim, not a question, not a sentence, but a word or phrase, because that's like dropping a little, dropping a pebble into a pool and seeing what happens. So, and then you ask prayerfully, why was that my stopping place? What was there for me? And that becomes the focus of meditation. Then you read it again and you ask, where's the invitation? How does this word or phrase, by association, open up a place of reflection or action that I need to be noticing? And all of this is doing it in the spirit of prayer. But I think of prayer in this context as just openness to being awakened or led or surprised by the process. And so there are writings about Lectio Divina that talk about, there's also Visio Divina, where you look at art or visual representations in that way. But then there's Lectio on Life, where you just adopt that practice of taking a walk and noticing just let me notice whatever stops me. Why do I stop there? Why do I stop to notice that this part of the path has been broken up by something that passed here? Why do I stop to notice the geese calling or whatever it is? The small irritants even. So I think of Lectio Divina as a habit of praying without ceasing, so to speak, and a practice of the presence of God, that you're always in a kind of, at some, at least subconscious level, there's always dialogue available with the Spirit who informs us and accompanies us. And then I just think of it as a practice of noticing. And noticing, well, I used to tell my students in lit classes, first of all, just start to notice things, notice word choices, notice images, notice how characters are presented, notice how he starts the chapter, blah, blah, about noticing. And then second instruction is notice what you noticed. Notice that you tend to notice verbs, or you tend to notice color references, or what is it that you tend to gravitate to? And then the third instruction is notice that you noticed what you noticed. But just like there's a level of self-awareness that can come about when you're being deeply intentional about any practice. So that's kind of one to laugh about, but still, I think, well, how am I as a reader? What's my reading life like? How can I make it more adventurous or disciplined or open-ended or engaging or fun? Fun. I have a lot of respect for fun.
Mm-hmm. The book, and you've mentioned a little bit about this already, but you've written it for a wider audience and looking at the various names. So for people who are expecting the typical canon of poetry. So I think you've got T.S. Eliot in there and others, but then there's other ones, and I should have put a little notebook in. There was a prayer from a trucker, and I sat down, and for some reason I was reading it on a Sunday, and I had coffee, and I spilled just a little bit out of my mouth because I have some older friends who were involved in the trucking industry, and that prayer, it's so real, and it speaks to you've got stuff in there for a little bit of everyone, and for the people who are interested in the things that they're particularly interested in, they'll be warm, but then they're also they're invited into the views and ways of living of other people that poetry can do so well.
Yeah. Well, I did try to get a variety of voices in there, different regions, different experiences of winter. There's one, I think, that's written from LA about the dryness in winter, which was familiar to me. I grew up in LA County. Yeah. And then both religious and non-religious poems, but all of them, because they are poems, verging on that place of prayer where the noticing itself is a way of taking stock of who we are in the order of creation.
that phrase verging on the point of prayer, it allows for so many things without making prayer sound trite. And I think God would want us to be invited into that. There could be things that could be prayer. It doesn't have to be something, okay, I mean, that's great too, the formal things, and that's great. But I love that invited into the things alongside.
Yeah, I think poetry, by being poetry, does take us toward that threshold of prayer. And some poems, of course, are prayers, but even secular poems, by paying the kind of attention to language that they do, are a way of receiving the gift of language that has a deep connection to the logocentric faith that we claim in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that I think other traditions claim too. The word, there's no getting away from the word. And even in traditions where there's the Om chanting, the sound, the acknowledgement that the universe is all verb and it's made of vibrations. I know that many people here are familiar with Christian Wiman and probably know that lovely poem, Every Riven Thing, that starts, God goes, belonging to every riven thing he's made, sing his being simply by being the thing it is. And then in the middle of the poem, he just stops. And there's one line that's one little sentence. He says, think of the atoms inside a stone. And everything in the poem is going. The poem is in movement. And it's a reminder, it's all in movement. It's all verb. And when God gave God's name to Moses in the story of the burning bush, it's a verb. I mean, it's Yahweh. There are many ways to interpret the word Yahweh, just because Hebrew is a very open-ended language like Aramaic. But one understanding of it is that it's the sound of breath. So I think if you can come to a place of imagining it all as verb, you get to that place of radical amazement that we're sort of gathered into nouns, but we're so temporary. Nouns are temporary, but the verb, the word, and the vibration is what is the livingness of living words. And so words and music are on the same continuum.
You've talked about this book being kind of a book in a lineage of your other books.
Yeah. Well, it is. And I think I did talk about that a bit when I talked about reflection. I've written enough books now to think, I just write this way, give me a topic, but probably what I'm going to do is keep writing this way, which is something that is both personal reflection and sharing my concern about a particular issue, as I did in Caring for Words and in Speaking Peace. But there is, when I put on my website, which if anybody goes to my website, it's very badly maintained and I don't do it very well. And so, but at least all the books are on there. But I think when I think of the lineage, I put on my website that concern that what really interests me is language and spirituality and healing the earth and each other. And yes, that's very big, but those are very entwined terms for me. I don't think that, I grew up in an evangelical home, and there was a lot of Bible reading and a lot of religious language, and it was completely authentic. And I loved my parents, and they were deeply invested people. They were missionaries. But so I grew up with the language of the King James Bible, but my mother was a teacher, my grandmother was a teacher, and the conversation in our home was something that people cared about. And as an adult, I realized what a huge gift that was. A lot of us have had privileged childhoods of one kind or another, and the privilege I had in my childhood was not money, but it was conversation. And I'm so, so grateful. It feels to me like that's such a great gift to give children, is to just talk in front of them, talk with them, ask them questions, but the conversations in our home were not child-centric. They were, they talked about politics and they quibbled about theology and they talked about what was going on in church and state. And occasionally they would ask us questions, but it was like, you get to be here and you get to grow up into this, but we're not going to just gather around and make you feel special because we're make it all about you. And we're not also going to send you off to your room because we're now having an adult conversation. You get to hear it. I loved that. I love it in retrospect. So I feel as though the writing that I've done is sort of a continuation of conversation. It's just taking the conversation into the public stream and saying, here's what I think. What do you think? Y'all want to come? Trying to do my best at that and trying to share something that people might not have thought of that way before. So.
Right. I heard someone recently say, and I can't remember who said it, but it was something like, for the people who do lots of reading and they do lots of thinking, it doesn't necessarily have to be thinking. You don't have to. I mean, I think you probably should read some to think well. But for people, if you want to be wise, part of wisdom is not just in reading and imbibing other wisdom and being wise, but also being able to express it to others, whether that is in speaking or in poetry or in writing. I think that's probably true. Do you have any hints for people when they're, this is not a short question, in terms of when you practice writing, do ideas come to your head? Like at this stage, probably you have an idea in your mind. If an idea comes into your head, you go, oh, that's actually a pretty good idea. Or that might be interesting for later. But how do you start off with writing? Like, does an idea come and you just kind of let it grow, or how does it?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone who writes will have a different answer to that question, but I don't know if my editors will let me call the new book this, but what I want to call it is Start with a Word. And it's because I think, especially with the undergraduates I've taught for many years, they get stuck trying to start with an idea. Like, oh, I just can't think of an idea for this research paper. And I think, don't think of an idea. Just don't try to have ideas. Start with a sentence. It's cold in here. That's a good enough sentence.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder who controls the thermostat. The thermostats at this school are controlled centrally. Why would that be? There are buildings all over campus, blah, blah. And all of a sudden you're into an issue, right? But you just started with, it's cold in here. Or if you start with something like even a phrase, I've had such interesting responses. I was working with a bunch of doctors. When I was teaching medical humanities, I had a writing workshop with a bunch of new doctors. And we talked about writing for a while. And then I said, okay, you've got 10 minutes. I'm going to give you a prompt. Just go wherever it takes you. And the prompt was, she looked up. That was it. And they wrote for 10 minutes. And really some remarkable pieces came out of that. You can imagine, she looked up. The patient looked up. She looked up when I walked into the room. But there's already encounter. There's already some energy in that idea. So it takes so little to trigger memory and imagination and thought. But I think if you try to start with an idea, you get in your own way. Because then what am I trying to approve or establish? And it's much more solid. A piece of advice that graduate professor gave to me that was so helpful one time was, he said, your writing is really competent, yada yada yada. You can have your good grades on your papers, but he said, I think it will help you. It's very architectural and you make your case and you're sort of building a case, but it's a little boring. Think of yourself as a tour guide taking people down a river that has its bends and turns, and you've been there before and they haven't. And you show them how you got there. Think of it as a kind of process in which there are surprises for you this time through. And so think about your process and share that. And that has been one of the best pieces of advice I ever got as a writer. Take someone with you and show them how you got there. So when I had research paper as an assignment for undergraduates, I took to telling them either as an introduction or a epilogue, they had to write a short narrative of process. Here's how I got to my question. Here's what began to happen as I pursued the question. Here were some new questions that came up. Here were some surprises along the way. And I said, doesn't have to be an introduction. That could end up to be the whole paper, how I pursued this question and where it led me. So I think really it seems important to me to surprise yourself and to stay open to where the spirit leads you as you're doing your work. I don't plan stuff very much.
Okay.
And I guess if you are a planner, I have a lot of respect for you, but I don't know how you think. Or at least it's just I've come to trust. I think there's a lot of trust in the process of doing any kind of anything in the arts. You just begin and you try to stay faithful to the process and notice what begins to happen and say yes. Just keep saying yes.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Thank you very much for indulging that question. I hope I didn't take away from if you wanted to say something more about your book.
We had no plans.
Before we go to Q&A, or maybe right now, is there any you wanted to any last words for the book other than my end, the little plug? It's a lovely book. It's got some great poetry, and also poetry that isn't expected necessarily to be poetry. I really enjoyed it, and I'm not that much of a poet person. I really enjoyed it.
Well, that makes me happy that people who say they're not poet people can enjoy it, because poetry is worth enjoying. And I think it's gotten a bad rap in this culture.
Mhm, mhm. Okay, I've got some questions come in. So just to start out with, first question. Marilyn said that poetry plows up the discursive soil and gives it new life. What poets and poems do that for her? And maybe she could read one from her book. That is a question I got actually from Jessica Walters, who is the Radix fiction editor.
Oh, hi, Jessica. Well, that's a fun question. T.S. Eliot has been a lifeline for me. Gerard, Manley, Hopkins. There will be no surprises here for people in a group like this. I really cherish so much great traditional poetry. But Eliot's four quartets, you could just, I think, especially in mature years, those are poems to come back and back to, because he's articulating what it is to be in that space just this side of mystical awareness, what it means to go into that practice of the presence of God, the awareness of the presence of the past, the presence of the cloud of witnesses. Those are his last poems. After that, he wrote some drama, but I love that. There's so many poets to mention. It's kind of like when people say, "Can you name a good restaurant for us in San Francisco?" And my mind goes blank. Like, it's San Francisco. I don't know. Look it up. There are hundreds. I really love Naomi Shihab Nye. She's an Arab American poet that some of you probably know. Her poems are very personal. And she's another one who's really invitational. Put together a couple of anthologies where she's just invited other poets to write about something. One is called What Have You Lost? And she just put that question out there. And I think it has 130 poems in there addressing the question of what have you lost? Everything from when you lost your keys to I lost my parents to I lost my way. But how wonderful to just gather people around a question like that. There's a friend of mine who is an Anglican nun. She publishes under the name Melanie Poli, but she goes by Sister Therese. And she is a delightful writer. She lives a very sequestered life up in Wisconsin, so I don't get to see her very often. I ended the collection with her poem, and Fear Shall Be No More. And it's a short one, so maybe I'll read it for you. I have the manuscript here. Yeah. Should I read that one? It's just a few lines, really.
Mm-hmm.
It's called And Fear Shall Be No More. I asked you, where does the white of the snow go after it is gone? Then you said, look, I want to show you this light. Take my hands. Let go. You have to, it's almost like haiku. There's a kind of a riddle. And it's an invitation to consider the light. When the object moves out of your way, what does it mean to see the light or the white of the snow? And we use the phrase seeing the light in various ways, but it's like if you try to see the light in the room around you, you see everything by the light. But if God is the light, and that's one of the two great, almost not metaphors, God is love and God is light. And I'm not convinced that that's actually a metaphor, but that the light, and that when we think about lightness of being, there's this sort of translucence to people who have a lightness of being. So I love poets who can help us to see light in some way, to see the there-ness of what's generally backgrounded.
Margaret Horowitz asked, or she said, thank you for commenting that the process of writing runs close to the work of prayer. Can you please elaborate on that a little?
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. It was very helpful to me at one point a few years back when I was telling my spiritual director that I felt frustrated by the fact that I didn't feel I was finding or making enough time for prayer in my daily life. And she listened to that and we reflected on it together. But then she said something that was so helpful to me. She said, it is good to make time for prayer and contemplative time, meditation, and all of that. But she said, I also think I know you well enough to know that your writing life is an extension of your prayer life. And I felt so grateful and honored that she would think of it that way, because in fact, it rang true to me that what happens on a good day when I'm really able to sit and write and reflect, there is something coming that's not me. Think about how often when you go to readings, poets or writers will say, people say, how'd you get that idea? And I don't know, it came to me. It came to me. That's such common language for how the process of inspiration or even thought works, is that something comes. And so it's a very short step from there to what I think of as prayerfulness, which is to acknowledge and be grateful to the source from which it comes and to say thanks. And I wasn't kidding when I say thank you a lot when I write. If I really nailed it in some sentence, I think, oh, thank you. That worked. And I don't think my writing is perfect. And any editor I've worked with will show things that didn't quite work. They didn't land right. Yeah. So, but I do think that there's a process of what I wouldn't be afraid to call channeling that any of us does when we're involved in creative work, which is that we're receiving. We become receivers. We have receptors. And something comes that we didn't plan. And there's point after point when our work is to say, yes, thank you. Okay, I'll go with that. That seems right. I will trust this. So to think about the language of consent and trust and writing as a tuning in, coming into alignment with the voice of the spirit who speaks to us or through us or with us, travels with us. We're not alone in this. And I don't think that creative work is generated from my experience altogether. I think it happens at that place that my experience has led me to, but there's something about it that I don't own.
I can cheat and ask a question. Northrop Frye talked about the educated imagination. And so as you're talking about the channeling and being receptive, active listening, what things can we do to have to discipline those things better? And by discipline, I mean the positive word, not the negative connotation.
To make them practices. You mean those things, meaning the receptivity?
Yeah.
Well, I think that we do need to feed our imaginations. Pleasure is really important. To practice taking pleasure in things and sharing that pleasure is to open ourselves, our hearts, and to furnish our imaginations by coming back to great literature and great art, the images. I grew up in a pretty iconoclastic religious tradition. And so when I became connected to the Catholic world through some very devout friends in college and began to look at images differently as something that could deepen our awareness of the sacred rather than being, idols or obstacles, that was so enriching. So I think that practice of noticing what touches me and really honoring my own deep pleasures and desires, like my pleasure in color. I'll tell you that one of the things I do these days when we listen to Democracy Now! For an hour in the morning, I love Amy Goodman. I love her reporting. I trust her. It's a great program. But it's a lot of hard stuff we're listening to these days. And what I do while I'm listening is I draw Zentangles and I color them in with these really bright Sharpies, that just make designs. And they're really pretty. And then I send them to people. The pleasure that I take in that is a way of holding some space in me that enables me also to listen to what's happening to the people in the world who are just getting slaughtered. And so it's kind of holding this balance, like I trust that there is life to be received with gratitude and claimed, even as I also believe that it's my job to look into the darkness and see how deep it is. But anyway, you were talking about the discipline of cultivating your imagination. And so I like the word honor, to honor it, to play, to really have a deep respect for playfulness as a dimension of spiritual life. I've recommended the book Free Play by Stephen Nachmanovitch so many times. He's a jazz musician, but he kind of looks at playfulness in the creative arts and poses the question, what is it that enables anyone, a musician or a performer, a teacher, a speaker, to just step into the moment and do improvisation of some kind? And he takes us into Zen Buddhism, all kinds of places. Haiku poetry is very playful. So what does it mean to live deeply into the moment and say yes to it? And the first rule in improv theater is whatever's going on stage, just say yes.
Right.
And go with it. So playfulness has something to do with consent to the terms on which we were given this life, which is that it's unpredictable. There are only a certain number of things we can predict, that there are only a certain number of things we can control. And so to live in trust and playfulness with that and say, oh, what is it now? I think that's a way of cultivating that trust, is to really be conscious of that question and that attitude, and make ourselves and other people comfortable with it.
Another question is, I have often been turned off by poetry that is cryptic and riddleish. I am drawn to simpler, easier to interpret poetry. Is there an understanding in academia that one style is proper and another is lowbrow?
First of all, I'm not a very good representative of academia, even though I've lived in it for a lot of my life. It's interesting, the highbrow, lowbrow distinction. There's a book called that by a Berkeley historian, Lawrence Levine, called Highbrow, Lowbrow. And he talks about that as a distinction that actually developed in the 20th century. And he uses the example of how people in the kind of the American outback, people who didn't have much formal education to speak of, would still grow up on the Bible and Shakespeare. And people could go out and perform Shakespeare and do little comedy routines based on some of Shakespeare's plays, and everybody would laugh because they'd all get it, because they didn't, what we think of, the distinction between sophisticated people and unsophisticated people now are based on, I think, some pretty artificial and historically predicated criteria. But yeah, to come back to the question about poems, haiku poets are a little bit like riddlers, but there are simple poems that are just lovely. There's the beginning of Yeats' poem, Lake Isle of Innisfree. It's just really expressing a kind of longing, and it starts so simply. I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there, and of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, and a hive for the honeybee, and live alone in the bee loud glade. And it goes on from there, but really, this is what I want. I want to go build my cabin. I want it to be on Innisfree. And so there's a core of simplicity to even some of the more difficult poems. And having said that, I think that if you can make it an act of trust to assume that if a poem is difficult, if it is also a poem that people have honored by recognizing it has value, then as a community of readers, there's something to be said for just venturing into it in a spirit of trust and willingness to learn. What is the value here? It's sort of like looking at Picasso's Guernica, or even one of his portraits, which with a distorted face and fragments of a human form that barely are human. So if you're looking for the representation of a human being, that's not what you're getting. So what is he being faithful to come back to that question? And George Steiner has an essay book actually called On Difficulty. And one of his points is some things deserve to be difficult because they need to be difficult, because that's the only way to get at the truth of them. So if you think about, E equals MC squared is a simple formula, but there's a whole lot of math that goes on behind that. So in a certain way, the difficulty of difficult poetry is inviting people into an experience of the understanding the intricacy of the ways that things are connected, or the subtlety. And so some poems just want to give you the pleasure of recognition, that little lovely shock of recognition. Oh, me too. And some poems want to say, come with me, I'm going to show you how things are connected in ways that you didn't even suspect. Or what words words do with each other when they come in oddball places. And I also want to acknowledge that it's not always easy to discern, is this poem worth the difficulty it is? I mean, 4 quartets are difficult poems that are absolutely worth it to me. But I've read some difficult poems that I think, this is not worth it to me. I'm done here. I'm going to go do something else. So I think you do have to honor your own desire. Notice what touches you, but don't assume that because some of a poem is lost on you, that there won't be a line in there that is actually worth waiting for because it will awaken you. And so look for the surprises and just kind of find a little path through the poem. You don't have to get all of it at once. And this all goes for prose too. There are difficult writers. I've had the great pleasure of teaching Moby Dick a number of times and loved it. And it's not a book I would recommend anyone read on their own with no conversation with other experienced readers, because Melville is playing all kinds of literary games in there. And if you think it's just a story about a hunt for a whale, you've missed most of it, because that's really just a pretext for all the kind of literary playfulness he's trying. Like, how do you get at the truth? Let's try scientific discourse. Oh, let's try a play. Let's try a sermon. Let's try, a sea chanty. All that stuff is in there. But I digress.
Mary Graves asks, of all the poems you included in the book, is there one that stays with you the most?
Well, let me look at the table of contents and see if I can answer that. There are several that gave me a surprise and pleasure. And actually, one of the interesting things was I didn't know a lot of these poems beforehand because it was an assignment. And they said, find poems about winter that you think are worth reading. I didn't know, and I've taught Emily Bronte, and I love her prose, but I didn't know her poems spellbound until I started looking for poems about winter. And I've been to the Bronte's home now on the Yorkshire moors that she writes about, and you get something about the windiness and the loneliness and the chill of those moors. So I loved that. And I loved the one, I love the ones about the loneliness of winter, the sadness. I really love the fact that some churches have what they call a blue Christmas service for people who find the season difficult, who have lost someone that year and are grieving, for instance. And so I found myself drawn to the poems that go that speak about the sorrow that comes up when you are sort of enclosed in interior spaces in winter and moved inward. And that's when, if you are lonely, the loneliness becomes more daily and more palpable. And I do love Yeats' Mother of God poem, which isn't even about Advent, but it's about the shock of what happened to Mary in this story. It's about the whole story that leads to the nativity. Yeah, there's every poem in there was a little bit of a discovery for me. And I was trying to find different poems from different regions, poems from people of different ethnicities, poems from men and women, all of that, just get different voices in there. And that meant that I got to orchestrate something that I couldn't really plan. But I loved Langston Hughes' little poem, Winter Moon. Let me read it to you. It's so short. It's 3 lines, so it's like a haiku. How thin and sharp is the moon tonight. How thin and sharp and ghostly white is the slim, curved crook of the moon tonight. That's all there is to it. But it goes back to that, hey, look, energy that I was talking about. Look with me. And the moon is an amazing thing. So there's a beginner's mind in there that was really so appealing. And when I use words like appealing or what you're attracted to and honoring that, I think often about Robert Ochs, a Jesuit who wrote a little book called God is More Present Than You Think. It's just 64 pages. It's a tiny book. But it was a real teaching moment for me to read that little book, because he talks about how the Spirit leads us through desire. He said so many people who are seeking the will of God tend to dismiss their own desires or proclivities or longings because they're looking for the will of God. But he said the desire, and I think here too of the pleasure, which I also link to desire. What awakens your heart? What gives you pleasure? What gives you a moment of recognition where you just say, "Oh yeah, me too"? And Ox is saying effectively, honor that. Notice that that itself is a gift, and that if something you are reading offers you that, then stay with that. Something's happening there. So I love that, especially because part of my particular Protestant lineage was pretty suspicious of desires and tastes and, the things that are playful and appealing, because we were all so earnest. And I had to grow out of being very earnest. I don't think it's the same as being sincere. I think you can be a little too earnest, and playful is a good thing to cultivate to offset that.
Another question. Katie Frank asks, when you pick up a poet's book, how do you read it? From cover to cover or at random?
Occasionally I read them from cover to cover because poets' books are pretty thin mostly. And I think, okay, I'll just start in and see what's here, especially if I don't know the poet at all. But many times I just pick it up and flip through it a little bit, and my eye is caught by a particular poem, and I just kind of try to see what's there and what appeals to me, and start with the ones I like and eat dessert first. Just start with what I like, and then when I've come to really appreciate something about how this poet works, then I can venture into the ones that I didn't find so immediately compelling.
Mm-hmm.
So, like so many other things, it's a pretty subjective process. There is something to be said for reading a collection sequentially, because you do organize them, if not thematically. At least if any of you have put together a collection of poetry, you know that there is a logic to what you start with and what you end with. So there's something to be said for respecting that. And I do believe in reading tables of contents. Just spending a moment with the table of contents page to see, how is this put together? What do I know about the landscape of this book just from reading the titles of the chapters?
I've got a question that is a mouthful, and I hope I can do this right. You talked about giving consent to the terms of life as it is given us, and approaching life and spirituality with a sense of playfulness. Are there particular places, people, or things that contribute to the sense of playfulness in you? Next sentence. What would you say to someone who suggests that we should prioritize grappling with pain and sorrow?
I think that actually is a wonderful question. And, I've done some years as a hospice volunteer, and my mother was a one-woman hospice volunteer. She saw a lot of people be born and die in India when she was a missionary. So I think even as a child, I was really well aware that sorrow and loss and pain are a dimension of life, and it was good to have that. I think that there's a way, even in pain, of maintaining something I'm broadly calling playfulness, which is to say, to go into the mystery of pain. That playfulness, as I'm thinking of it as a spiritual quality, has to do with an openness to mystery. And grief, the goneness of somebody who has just died, is shocking, even if it was an expected death. And so I think about the way, again, I'll use Eliot as an example in East Coker, especially one of the four quartets, the way he writes about loss and the pastness of the past and the mystery of that pastness and the presence of the past and how what is gone is still with us. That dimension of loss has this quality of, what have we here that maintains the liveliness of a kind of curiosity that I would call playful, even though there's so much pain. And honestly, these days, I told you I watch Democracy Now! Every morning. They've shown a lot of footage about what is happening as Gaza has been reduced to rubble, and parts of Ukraine and Sudan, to watch what people are going through. And I want to mention a little book about that that's worth knowing about. But I also look at these kids who are climbing around on the rubble and the women and the men who are holding dead children in shrouds, crying out to Allah. I mean, in the streets, praying. And I am so humbled by the culture of people who pray and they gather around each other with a kind of spontaneity. And playful certainly sounds like the wrong word to bring to that, but there is a kind of spontaneous gathering that they do in their collective horror that is like nothing I've seen elsewhere. And so to stay alive in the middle of all that is to keep that prayer connection open, to be aware of our situation and that we are in it together. And I just feel like there's some kind of claiming of life, even in the midst of so much death, that is to learn from. And the book I wanted to mention was Susan Sontag's last book. It's a little book called Regarding the Pain of Others. And it's mostly about war photography. The question she poses is, now that it has become possible for us through photography to look at an uncountable number of images of other people's pain, what ethical responsibility does that give us as witnesses of other people's pain? How are we to witness it respectfully enough? Or how are we to position ourselves? And she uses the example of if you're sitting down with the front page, this is when newspapers had pages, but the front page of the New York Times, and they show you an image of, a mourning wife, a wife mourning over a dead body. And you take that in and you feel stricken by it. You feel whatever you feel. You're human. You have that connection. Then also, it's a disposable object. You turn the page, you see some ads, you go on with your coffee, you fold up the Times. And she said, now that we've made the human image into a disposable artifact, it's put us in a profoundly different relationship to other people's suffering. So how do we keep awake our ethical sensibilities and our capacity for empathy? And do photograph help that or numb us out? It's a really important question to keep alive now. How do I pray for people who live in a different culture halfway across the world, to whom we ourselves are doing harm by sending weapons and whatnot? But keeping open that question humbly is to really live into the question, how can I do this? How do they do this? And they're not just rhetorical questions. What do we learn from our own suffering that enables us to imagine our way into others so that we can even hold them in a place of prayer? It's kind of a long answer, but and I said I taught a little short workshop-y course one time called Speaking of Sorrow. And the whole point of the course was, how do we speak of sorrow? How do we write into our own and others' grief? It's good work, and I think we need to do it together. And I think I live in a place of sorrow every day these days when I think about our common life and what is happening to the notion of the common good and the created order. But I think to refuse the moments of joy would be um, to not be willing to live in the paradox that's really at the heart of any great spiritual tradition is paradox. Both things are true. Hold them. I mean, it's when Jesus talks about in the Gospel of John, um, a light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Or when he says, "In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world." I have overcome, but I'm standing here on the eve of the crucifixion. Just to live into that paradox of all is always now is to live at the edge of mystery in that place of beginner's mind. And I sure think we can't do this alone, not any of us. And I'm so grateful for gatherings where people can think together, classes and workshops and this kind of thing. Just any gathering where people are willing to sit and be human together and think about how do we claim the things that help us do that.
As always, thank you so, so very much.
Oh, pleasure.
It that was a l- there was a lot of things in that last point. There's a certain, sometimes heaviness is good, um, because heavy can maybe push us in a direction to think. At least for me, I appreciate you mentioning those things. That sometimes it's not as fun to talk about things, weighty issues, but I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate you and I appreciate all of you who came. I just am honored that you came, and I am so grateful to be able to share both these concerns and these pleasures with people who care about them. So thank you.
Thank you very much again. And yes, thank you very much for the people who came. It is, I mentioned last time at the first, so this is our second event. You have all stayed, you've come. Thank you so much for your gift of attention. We really, really, really appreciate it. And thank you so much for the questions. We hope to see you again. And Marilyn, thank you again very much. I'm going to include in this video some of the books that you mentioned. Can you mention a number of really great books? So I'll talk to you afterwards, and we'll include, I'll just put a list, books mentioned that I think will be handy. Have a lovely evening. Thank you very much again.